In 2020, the IMF stated that the coronavirus pandemic has been a crisis like no other. Lockdowns have led to supply chain disruptions as factories are temporarily shut. As fewer factors of production are employable, the productive capacity of the economy falls. Meanwhile, firms are forced to utilize more inefficient inputs, leading to a rise in costs. Aggregate supply hence falls. Furthermore, the fall in incomes causes AD to fall, inducing firms to reduce production because they see an unplanned accumulation of inventories. Due to the reverse multiplier process, the fall in real national income is more than proportionate to the initial fall in AD. These simultaneous shifts in AD and AS lead to falls in both actual and potential growth. Since demand for labour is derived when firms reduce production and hire fewer factors of production, this leads to a rise in unemployment. Countries have implemented many counter-cyclical policies to solve the issues brought on by the onset of COVID-19. And over to you, Min.
Let's look at Taiwan, which is a small, open and export-oriented economy which has faced falls in economic growth and rises in unemployment. Taiwan resorted to a discretionary fiscal policy, like the Triple Stimulus Voucher Program, where consumers were encouraged to buy $3,000 worth of consumption vouchers for the price of $1,000, with the government footing the bill of 51.1 billion Taiwan dollars as a direct subsidy for consumption, causing the effective disposable incomes of consumers to rise. Due to the income effect, consumers began to increase their consumption, leading to a rise in aggregate demand. Due to the multiplier effect, which operates on the principle that one man's spending is another man's income, the increase in real national income will be more than proportional to the initial rise in AD. Taiwan's multiplier from consumer voucher distribution is 1.47, giving us an MPC of 0.320. When the government distributes $50 billion to consumers spend some of the $50 billion, while the rest is saved, taxed, or spent on imports. Thus, their expenditure increases by $16 billion. In response to this rise in AD, firms step up production by $16 billion and employ more labour from households, causing real national income to increase by $16 billion. Of this, households spend $5.12 billion, which will lead to a further rise in AD and thus induce firms to further increase production by $5.12 billion, increasing induced consumption by $1.63 billion. This continues until the sum of the rise in taxes, savings and imports is equal to the initial injection of $50 billion. Thus GDP rose by a total of $73 billion.
The policy is applicable in Singapore, because Singapore too is a trade-reliant economy that is sensitive to global demand conditions. As exports fell by 13%, the pandemic contracted the economy by 5.8%. Recognizing this, the government has implemented a similar policy, the SG Rediscovers Voucher Scheme, that handed out $100 in direct subsidies for consumption in the tourism sector, increasing consumption and causing a more than proportionate rise in national income. Ostensibly, Singapore has a small multiplier value at about 0.6 in 2007. Our compulsory savings scheme raises our marginal propensity to save, and our lack of natural factor endowment leads to a high marginal propensity to import. Nonetheless, the multiplier value increases for the SG Rediscover vouchers in the context of COVID-19, as MPM for this policy is 0 since consumers are limited to local attractions, and MPS is low since consumers cannot save the voucher beyond its expiration date. Hence, the multiplier value is high, effectively raising output. However, such an expansionary fiscal policy should be a one-off policy, given that it can lead to inflationary pressures in the medium run. The Singapore economy operates near full capacity, evident in its tight labour market. As the economy recovers from the pandemic, AD rises due to induced consumption. However, AS is likely to remain static, given that pandemic measures like work from home limit productive capacity and the movement of labour and goods remain restricted. A prolonged expansionary fiscal policy may thus lower real growth. The use of expansionary fiscal policy outside of recessions may create a sense of entitlement that can weaken the incentive to work, causing more workers to leave the labour market, which hampers actual and potential growth.
Moving on, let's take a look at the United States. Lockdowns and mass hospitalizations have led to a real GDP contraction of 3.5% in 2020, as well as a record high unemployment rate of 14.8% in April 2020. In March 2020, the Federal Reserve purchased $700 billion worth of bonds and securities from domestic financial institutions. By injecting liquidity, the Fed caused an increase in money supply, equivalent to $700 billion multiplied by the money multiplier. This shifts the MS curve to the right, causing interest rates to fall from 1.75% to 0.25%. This then stimulates consumption and investments as the cost of borrowing falls. Consumers can now afford big-ticket items, whereas firms expect rates of returns for new projects rise, causing a multiplied rise in AD.
Unfortunately, this policy holds little relevance in Singapore. Firstly, Singapore is a small but open economy. This makes us reliant on imported factors of production due to a lack of natural endowments, and reliance on exports due to a small domestic market, causing net exports to be a whopping 322% of GDP. To protect ourselves against imported inflation, given the significance of the foreign sector, Singapore chooses to prioritize exchange rate stability. Secondly, Singapore is an interest rate taker because any adjustment in the interest rate will be offset by hot money flows. For example, if the MAS increases the money supply to lower interest rates, hot money flows will increase, exerting a downward pressure on our exchange rate. This is represented by the gap between I1 and BP. To correct this, the central bank can either reverse the monetary policy, which will make it ineffective, or it can intervene in the forex market by purchasing domestic currency. Either way, the LM curve will shift back to the original equilibrium and economic growth will not have occurred.
Comparatively, the international Mundell-Fleming model tells us that fiscal policy is especially preferable for a small open economy like Singapore. An increase in government expenditure causes a rise in money demand, causing a rightward shift in the IS curve. This causes an incipient rise in interest rates, which increases hot money inflows, putting an upward pressure on the Singapore dollar. Since Singapore maintains a managed float exchange rate, the MAS would counter this by selling newly minted Singapore dollar to accumulate foreign reserves, with the result that money supply increases, causing a rightward shift in the LM curve, leading to a rise in output. Thus, fiscal policy in the short term benefits Singapore greatly.